RAP Track, or the Reimagine America Project Truth, Reconciliation, Atonement Commission of Charlotte, is a grassroots community-led effort to say that we have waited too long for the conversation about race in America. Over the years, we've gotten rid of slavery, but we've kept race and got Jim Crow. We've gotten rid of Jim Crow and separate but equal, but kept race and gotten the war on drugs and mass incarceration. We've begun to work against mass incarceration and kept race and gotten a new supremacist movement that said it was going to make America great again. We believe that the time has come to stop responding to instances of racism with minor tweaks in a broken system. No, we need to dig out the root of racism, and that is the concept of race itself. You see, the concept of race is the notion that there is a human hierarchy of better or worse types, where some with lighter skin are given more wealth and power and privilege, and those with darker skin are forced to live with their backs against the wall. Race began as a way of taking people from land and land from people, legitimating why some people were born to lead and others were born to serve. Race only serves to undermine the possibility of equality. We cannot at the same time be a nation that holds these truths to be self-evident, that all human beings are created equal, and a nation that believes that we are separated by the color of our skin and the shape of our body or the kink of our hair. That we are somehow or another different in intelligence and in character, that we are somehow or another different in the way that we are valued as human beings. No, we must change our system if we are to live up to the exceptional ideals upon which our nation is built. Today, we are beginning our work with an initial examination of two of the systems in Charlotte that have a significant impact on the African American community. We'll look at policing and the court prison system. During our time together tonight, we will hear from three different types of witnesses. Number one, we will begin by hearing from two historical witnesses who will talk about policing in Charlotte and some of the problems inherent with this system. Then we will hear and spend the majority of our time hearing from three impacted witnesses who will talk about their experiences with police and the criminal justice system. And we will end our time tonight hearing from a confessing witness who will share about how his eyes were opened as a judge to racial inequalities and what he's begun to do to foster systemic change. We hope that this will be an informative, honest, and sincere conversation that might help us to see why we can no longer allow ourselves to be divided along racial lines, or to assume that there is any validity to the concept of race. We all have a lot of work to do to overcome the lie that we've been told now for more than 401 years. That work begins tonight, and we need each and every one of you to work with us to foster a more just and equitable city, state, and nation. We wish to reimagine, renew, rebuild an America that lives up to its ideals. And we need each and every one of you to make this vision, this dream, a reality. I would like to introduce to you the former Assistant Chief of the Charlotte-Mecklenburg Police Department, Ms. Vicki Foster. Vicki will speak to us a bit about the state of policing in Charlotte and some of the things that she's seen in her more than 25 years on the police force here. Let's take a look at what Vicki Foster has to say.
So I think that, most of us kind of know the history of policing and how the history of policing started, and that African-American officers, first of all, weren't even allowed on the force for many, many, many years. And then when they were not allowed to make arrests of Caucasian citizens, and they predominantly worked in African-American neighborhoods. So, policing started off with racism. And a lot of people wanted to be police officers in those days because of what the job consisted of. And so unfortunately, that history has passed down, throughout the years. And, of course, some people truly believe that it's still absolutely embedded within most police departments. And I will say there definitely is a component of that. I truly believe that most people today want to become a police officer because they do want to help people. But of course, we always have the few, just like you do in any other job, that don't necessarily join for the right reason.
You mentioned something about an inherent fear of Black men. Tell me more about that.
Well, I think that, history has shown us that there is a form of inherent fear of African American males. It's that fear of you're going to be able to overtake me. And so that is a fear that we cannot change. That's just not a fear that we'll be able to change. That's going to be something that someone else has to figure out within themselves. Why do I feel that way? And there's an inherent fear of how African American men in particular, respond with the police and correlate and how they talk and how they communicate. And that right there within itself sometimes leads to some of the things that we're seeing across the nation. Thank you for that. It's I don't quite know where to go at this point in time with that, because I think that it's a frightening notion to think that an officer's internal fear can put someone else at greater risk. How do we police that fear? How do we shift that attitude so that we can look at a white suspect, a Black suspect, all of them with the same lens? That's where I'd love to see policing go. Thank you so much. Our next speaker tonight is our first impacted witness. She is a longtime Charlotte resident. She is a mother. She is among the most significant activists I know in the city.
Let me go ahead and get to the point. Back some time ago in 2011, my son Larico Williams was murdered by a CMPD officer. He was tasered. The officer that tasered my son received training 3 months before he actually murdered my son. And that's a big problem. So people can talk about training officers. It has nothing to do with it. It has something to do with training, but not all, because this officer received training and he took it upon himself to do what he wanted to do. And a part of the process of going through courts, he lacked respect for his own superior, because it came out in testimony and through a deposition. He had an incident where he interfered in a pursuit, and his own superior requested for him to step down, and he declined. He testified himself that he was put on suspension for just 1 day, but to him, he was like, well, I kind of figured it was going to be a jump and run, and it was. So, okay, I got 1 day. So my point to that is, if you have an officer that's patrolling in the community that don't even have respect for his own superior to tell him to step down and do not continue to engage, because he don't really know what his superior may have seen, and he still disregard a command, that's a problem. One of my issues come from one officer by the name of Anthony Payne. He said some inappropriate things, and the fact that both officers were like, oh, I thought he was faking. That's terrible, because if you don't know how to distinguish somebody faking from going in convulsions, you don't need a badge.
I'd like to call our next impacted witness, a young man who's been involved in the criminal justice system, who's seen the ins and outs of policing here in Charlotte, and who has been able to redeem his life after a considerable struggle throughout this process. Mr. Arkevius Armstrong.
I was a young man who struggled again with trying to find my way, trying to find my identity. And, with having the many issues that I had coming up, it wasn't to me by surprise that, I saw a lot of young men like myself. And again, I had my brothers, I had mothers, my father who was also going in and out the system. And so coming from an environment where, the violence was very high, the drug activity was very high. And, you saw it. You saw police brutality. You saw police wrongfully just pulling people over just because they come down a certain street. You saw police drawing their guns on people who were just standing or sitting in front of the yard, just gathering, you saw all of these things. As a young kid, I used to see on a day-to-day basis where, you know, you can be standing outside playing and 10 police officers might run up from out of the path, you know, and just get everybody on the ground and put guns to the back of their heads. I've also, as a young man, I witnessed my mom on 2 different occasions. You know, at the time she was struggling with her drug addiction, but I saw my mom on 2 different occasions been drugged out of a house and a shotgun pointed to the back of her back. And, you know, as a young man, I think I had to been no more than like 7 or 8 years old playing outside to witness that. It was traumatizing. And so what we have in what we see in today in society, and, you know, it's not to point the finger at everybody, but at the same time, we have to address the elephant in the room. What we see is young people of color are emotionally traumatized, psychologically traumatized, and fed up, tired, and sick and tired and looking for something to change.
Your story is so powerful, and we need more people to hear that. There was something else that you said that is so insightful, and that is the responsibility of the media. And it is absolutely true that the media is part of this racial stereotyping. They are a huge part of it. And the way they depict people, the way they interview people, the language, the adjectives. And, you know, until you said that, I hadn't really thought about the degree of their responsibility, because they also pick on the conflict. So we don't see the stories of people like you who are doing amazing things and became self-aware and found good role models, and now you're sharing with other young men. We don't hear those stories. We hear the stories of the people who are in the cycle of drugs and crime and getting locked up, and we see the pictures of people, you know, with their hands behind their back in the jumpsuit, and that is part of the stereotype that people who look like me form from the media.
Want to make sure that we bring on our next impacted witness this evening, Mr. Cedric Dean, who similarly has been impacted at a young age by the criminal justice system here in Charlotte. We're going to hear his story, and after he gives his story for, let's say, about 10 minutes or so, we'll have questions asked of him by by Reverend Glency Redrick, and a listening response, a hearing response by Mayor Jennifer Roberts. Mr. Dean.
Much for the opportunity to be here today, and thank you for the work that y'all are doing to make a difference in our community. My name is Cedric Dean, and I was born in Charlotte, North Carolina, to a single 18-year-old mother. After graduating from Hardin High School in 1972, the year I was born, my mother began working for the City of Charlotte Water Department. Because she was not making or earning a livable wage, she was forced to take upon a second job cleaning up office buildings, and then a third job as the church secretary, church clerk rather. But this allowed me to have too much free time on my hands, looking for a brotherhood that I did not have as an only child. At 13 years old, I was rebirthed into a new world of crime, drugs, guns, and violence. In fact, I had a short-lived stint as an armed robber and a drug dealer. By the time I was 16, I was arrested and placed inside the same cell blocks as adult killers, robbers, and rapists, 16 years old. Spent 5.5 years in a terroristic-like training. 11 months after my release in February of 1994, I was charged in a 6-count federal indictment for conspiracy to distribute crack cocaine. What I didn't know at the time was that there was a 100-to-1 ratio because of Lynn Bias had died, and the Reagan administration saw fit to make it an exaggerated response to say crack is this dangerous drug. So I decided, because I dared to argue that crack and powder was the same drug, because I had the nerve to exercise my Sixth Amendment constitutional right to represent myself at trial, to say that crack and powder was the same drug, I was sentenced to life plus 5 years. The judge said if you die and come back to life, you still got 5 years to do it. Determined not to die in prison. I learned the law by reading every single law book available in the law library. I studied every single case that came out that had a direct or indirect correlation to crack cocaine. 7 years into my term, I was placed in a special housing unit, the Hole, where I was confined in a cell for 24 hours a day and endured the traumatic effects of being inside of something the size of your bathroom and having to hear voices in my head all day long. And it had the point to where, you know, with a lot of free times on my head, I read an urban street novel called Be More Careful by Shannon Holmes, who had also served time in prison. I enjoyed the book so much that upon completing and reading it, I started writing a tale of my own called For the Love of the Streets, my first literary work, which was published in 2008. Subsequently, I wrote and published 19 more books from prison. Now I would say that on the street, I didn't have the opportunity for somebody to reach deep down inside and discover that there was an author in me. They always just looked at me as a gangster.
Our final witness tonight is a man that in some respects needs no introduction. Judge Lou Trosh is famous here in the city of Charlotte for the work that he has done over the years. He is about to tell a bit of his own story about his, dare I say, becoming woke. So let me, before I say anything else, I don't want to steal any of your thunder, Judge Lou Trosh.
You can't be blind to see that the people that come into my courtroom are brown and black young men. You've heard the stories from Mr. Armstrong, from Ms. McCarthy and Mr. Dean about their experiences, and that's what I saw every day. But that, as a judge, that wasn't my problem. At least that's what I thought, right? That maybe that's the police, maybe that's the prosecutors, maybe it's the prison officials, maybe it's probation officers, maybe it's the legislators that make the laws, like the laws about crack cocaine versus powder cocaine. But after all, I'm a judge, and you know, our symbol is Lady Justice, so we're blind to bias, to discrimination. At least that's what I told myself for many years. And then I had some experiences, and one of those experiences really changed me. I was in court, I was in juvenile court, and I had two young men who were charged with an armed robbery. They were specifically charged with trying to rob a McDonald's here in Charlotte, in Matthews, actually. And I was scheduled to hear what's called a first appearance. First appearance, some of you may know, some of you may not know, is where right after you've been arrested for a serious charge, you go before the judge lets you know what the charge is that you have, what your lawyer, who your lawyer is going to be, and what you're facing, and then schedule another court date. In juvenile court, you also, because we don't have bail or bond in juvenile court, and so we set conditions of release or decide whether juveniles should remain in detention, because this was in juvenile court. At any rate, I've got a lot of cases that afternoon. So I've got a lot to do that afternoon. I've got the two young men that are charged with the armed robbery and then a number of other cases. I figured it would be pretty perfunctory. I would go through the hearing and then move on. So I called the first case in. The young man came in from detention, as I expected he would be. Armed robbery is about as serious as it gets in juvenile court. And when I called him in, and he came in with the bailiff and sat down next to his attorney, a whole host of people came into the courtroom, his parents, his grandparents, some aunts and uncles, neighbors. The family had a stack of letters about this young man and how this was totally out of character for him. So I listened to what everybody had to say, and what I learned was that he and his co-defendant had watched this movie called Ocean's 11. Now, I'm old, I remember Ocean's 11. Some of you all may or may not remember it, but it's a movie about a heist that some people pulled on a casino, on an evil casino owner out in Las Vegas. So these two young men watch that movie and decide, oh, let's have our own heist. We don't have casinos, as you all know, here in Charlotte, but we do have a lot of McDonald's. So they go to the McDonald's, they try to commit this robbery, and it's an utter failure. They get arrested in the parking lot. So as I hear about the charge, and I let him know about his lawyer and what he's facing, I am now trying to decide whether or not he needs to remain in detention. I hear from his family how this is out of character. He's never been in trouble, never been suspended from school. His pastor from his church came to the court hearing. He was very active in his church. He was not gang involved. There was no history of drug abuse. He had very strong family connections, et cetera, et cetera. None of the risk factors that we typically see in juvenile court that lead kids to get into a lot of trouble. I wasn't hearing any of that. And so I said to the family, well, let me hear the recommendations from my team. And I have a court team that works with me. So I have a district attorney, I have a prosecutor, I have a court counselor or a probation officer that makes recommendations. I have case managers, and I have a defense attorney. And we always work together. So I asked their recommendations, and the court counselor said, well, Judge, we think that he may be eligible for our alternatives to detention program, which means if what the family's saying checks out, then we can release him on an electronic monitor with intensive supervision and a list of requirements. And so I said, okay, well, that makes sense. I asked the district attorney their recommendation. She agreed that that was the right thing to do. The defense attorney, I asked what they thought, and they said, well, could we just come back sooner, Judge? Today's Monday. We'd like to come back on Thursday instead of waiting all the way until next Monday, because if this checks out, then we want this young man to get back into school. And so I asked everyone if that was doable, and they all agreed that it was. So we scheduled the hearing for Thursday. So he leaves the courtroom, the family leaves the courtroom, I call in the co-defendant. I wait for the co-defendant to come out of detention. I wait some more for the deputy to get him out of detention. And I finally, and meanwhile, the families come in again, a mom, dad, which I often don't see in juvenile court, but mom, dad, grandma, grandpa, a coach from the school came because he was really active on the sports team at school. They had letters, they all came in. And I finally turned to the deputy, a little irritated, and said, can you bring in our other co-defendant? I've got a lot of hearings to do today. And he looked at me and said, Judge, there's nobody else back there. Well, yes, there is. The co-defendant, he says, Judge, there's nobody else back in the holding cells. And about that time, I noticed that one of the people that had come into the courtroom was, in fact, the co-defendant, the other juvenile. He sits down by his attorney, and we go around. I hear more of the same information, ask for recommendations, same court counselor, same district attorney, same defense attorney, or I had a different defense attorney in this case, same case managers. And the recommendations were, Judge, we'd like him to stay on house arrest, to stay with his family, go to school every day, stay away from the co-defendant, sort of a standard list of pre-release conditions. And so I started asking questions, and I asked, we just had the co-defendant and he's in detention. Was he the gunman? And I heard, no, they both had guns. And I said, well, was it the other guy's idea? No, these guys have been best friends since they were 7 years old. They live one street over. They watched this movie and they came up with it together. Well, did the other young man make threats, or was he the leader or did he threaten the police, or what's going on? And as I asked more and more and more questions, there is literally no difference between these two young men whose families were friends, who lived one street over from one another, who committed the same offense. Both of them they turned out to be pellet guns, we found out later, but you may or may not know that pellet guns now are not like Red Ryder BB guns. They look like Glocks or 357. So they both had weapons or pellet guns. They were both equally involved, and yet one was in detention and one was not. And the fact that probably everybody who's on this conference or call and commission hearing knows that one was white and one was black, and also knows that the white young man was with his family at home and the African-American young man was in a detention cell. And so I did at that point what Americans are taught to do when we look at a disparity or what appears to be discrimination. I looked for the racist in the room. I was trying to find Archie Bunker or Richard Spencer, the person who was intentionally trying to treat these two young men differently. Maybe it was the police, maybe it was a district attorney, maybe it was the court counselor, maybe it was another judge who signed an order placing the young man in secure custody. I was looking for who that was. And as I looked around the room, I realized, wait a minute, I work with all of these individuals every day. They're my court team. They're also not all old white men like I am. I had women, men, black, white workers, lawyers and case managers and court counselors, so people from all demographic groups. And yet, and I knew that they did not intentionally do this. They were trying to do the right thing. And as I asked the questions, I watched the light bulb go on over each of their heads as they realized, oh my gosh, we treated these two young men completely differently. And I realized something else was going on. And at that moment, I then had probably the scariest realization of all. How many times have I done the same thing? How many times have I, maybe not in a case that was this obvious, right? This was two young men doing the exact same thing, but maybe there was a little shade of a difference, or maybe it was two different times of the day. How many times have I treated unintentionally people completely different based on their race? And it brought me back to something that had happened a couple years earlier, well, 4 or 5 years before that, right when I came on the bench. So maybe it was like 7 years earlier. I was in abuse and neglect dependency court. And one of the attorneys, a very courageous and frankly, very kind to me lawyer, came to me and said, Judge, I'd like to talk to you. And she came to my chambers and we talked, and she said, look, I don't know how to tell you this, but there are some social workers that feel like you have different standards for families based on criteria that really doesn't have anything to do with the law. And I said, what are you talking about? And she said, well, you have different standards for African-American social workers or Hispanic social workers than you do for white social workers, and likewise families, or at least that's what some people are saying. She said, I don't think that. I think you're a jerk across the board, but there are people that think that you are more difficult with some families. And I will tell you, as a white man, my reaction, I thought that outwardly I was calm, cool, and collected, listening respectfully and responding respectfully. The reality probably was that I was very defensive, very questioning, and very ready to explain away why those perceptions were incorrect. Inside, I was feeling horrified, angry. How could someone think that of me? I'm not a racist, because again, my experience, all of our experiences, if you are accused of, or if you treat people differently, then you're Archie Bunker, then you're a bigot. And that's all I heard was I'm a bigot. And I'm like, I've done everything my whole life to be neutral, to not be this way. I can't believe they must be wrong. These perceptions are wrong. That was my first thought. So we finished the meeting and I thought about it. I sat on it all weekend. And the next week, I asked the lawyer to come back out. We had some hearings, and I asked between hearings to talk to her. And I said, look, clearly, just because I don't think I'm doing it doesn't mean I'm not doing it. My perceptions are not the only perceptions in the world. And clearly, something is going on where I am giving off a vibe, or maybe I am treating people differently without even realizing I'm doing it. Can you help me? And again, to her benefit and to my guardian ad litem attorney's benefit, both of them agreed they would be my tickler system, my warning system. And they courageously, kindly, compassionately to me would kind of let me know. And over time, it really helped me see that sometimes you make assumptions. I think Mr. Dean or Mr. Armstrong mentioned implicit bias. And so that led me and some other people to a long journey to try and figure out what's going on besides the bad cop kneeling on somebody's neck. There's something larger going on. There's a systemic thing that's going on. And I learned a lot, and we've learned a lot. So we started an initiative called Race Matters for Juvenile Justice and have gone on a long journey to figure out what is the court system's role? What is the school system's role? What is the police department's role? What is probation's role? What is the Department of Social Services role in creating these systems that either intentionally or even with best intentions, unintentionally treat people very, very differently?
Well, thank you so much, Judge Trosh. It is always wonderful to hear this story and to know that you had an experience that helped you to see your role in a system that wasn't just.